Welcome, we're the AIRROUTE66 guys. And before we get started today, we'd just like to say a special thank you to Sun and Fun for the opportunities we've had to participate in the forums and in person and now virtually. Thank you, Laura and Lights and everybody at Sun and Fun. We much appreciate it. So today our presentation is going to be on surviving catastrophic piston engine failure in Alaska based on the Airfax Journal article. And, more importantly, tips to reach TBO safely. So our presenters today are myself, Marshall Severson, and Dan Billman. As far as a little bit of background information, first off in the pictures here, that's Dan and Marshall. Dan's on the left in both pictures, Marshall's on the right, myself. And we're out of south central Alaska and the interior, and the picture on the right is at Merrill Field. The picture on the left was shot over Russia. And as far as myself goes, and some of the background that might help you understand this particular presentation we're doing and where I'm coming from personally, is that I did have a catastrophic engine failure, survived it very well, and I've also taken, with a lot of help, an aircraft engine beyond TBO. And I'll turn it over to Dan now for any comments he'd like to make about himself or what we're doing.
Well, I'd like to thank Sun and Fun too. This is a good opportunity, and we appreciate aircraft and safe aircraft operations in Alaska because we have a lot of lonesome country, and it's so important to keep our aircraft in tip-top shape. And the reason we are using Marshall's 172 with an 0300 as a kind of a subject point, that aircraft, we knew it had to be in good shape because we flew across Alaska to Nome and then over across the Bering Sea to Providencia, Russia. And so, yes, we took rafts and wetsuits and did the right things, but mainly we needed to know that that aircraft was in great shape. And so I'm a high-time pilot and a A&P IA, and lived in Alaska most of my adult life since before high school, and learned to fly in high school, and have enjoyed an aviation career, and with lots of flying hours, I've never really experienced a catastrophic engine failure like Marshall has. I've just been lucky, and again, trying to keep everything just right. But I will turn this back to Marshall, and we'll move through the program.
Thanks, Dan. And we're on the slide now that says what we'll talk about and who we're going to talk to. We want to talk to anybody who's interested in safely flying aircraft and good maintenance techniques. Specifically, we're targeting piston single engine GA private pilots, not 135s, for example. The rules are different, but for your Part 91 operators, generally private pilots, that's who we're targeting, but good info for all. And we'll discuss surviving a catastrophic engine failure in Alaska, and better yet, tips to reach TBO. So moving on to the next slide, here's a picture of Skippy. My wife, Margaret, and I, way back when, owned a 1961 Piper PA-22 Colt. It had a 4-cylinder Lycoming 0235 C1B engine in it, made about 108 horsepower, and we used it for fun flying in Alaska, and what a joy. That picture there, this is within 25 miles of Anchorage. We're landing on a lake, frozen lake. You got huge, aircraft-sized icebergs in the area. Just a fantastic place to fly, and very rewarding. So moving on a little bit on the life of the aircraft, that Piper on the next slide. We owned it for a few years. The IA advised us that we needed to replace our engine because it was rusty, and we did so. We went out and searched and got a replacement engine, mid-time engine, and got back in the air. And the event that I'm going to talk about specifically occurred in January of 1992. And for the younger folks out there, it really just does seem like yesterday. When things happen to you, you remember them. As you get older, you'll find that certain things stick with you. So this is the flight where a problem developed. And just for a little bit of background here, the slide shows a chart of the Anchorage area. This flight was from Merrill Field, which is on the lower left-hand part where the little red dot is. That's Merrill Field. A little bit southwest of there is Anchorage International. To the northeast, a big paved airport you can see with the blue dot on it. It's Elmendorf Air Base, and then just to the upper right of that is Bryan Army Airfield, now part of Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. And the flight was just basically going to go out of Merrill Field northeastward, east of that big restricted area there, and stay within about 25 miles of Anchorage and go on up to that lake you see in the northeastern corner of the map, the Eklutna Glacier area. So this was just an afternoon flight in daylight hours. The days are short in January in Alaska, but it was a good day, some cloudiness, but no weather issues to think of, and it wasn't extremely cold or anything either. So basically on the trip up towards the glacier, I climbed up to about 4,500 feet, and the temperature was about, in the aircraft engine, was showing about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. But on returning, it got hot quickly. And before the engine blew, it was making a repetitive cyclical type noise. And I can best relate it to, when we were kids, we'd put a card through the spokes on our bicycle, and pretend we had an engine. Well, it was like that, except that kind of noise, that clapping, cyclical noise, except it was much louder, painfully louder, and got louder and louder. And I did have headsets on when we first started out at our tender ages in flying. Hardly ever used headsets, didn't have intercoms, but anyway, I could hear radio contact, which turned out to be really good, with my headset on, but it was extremely noisy even with the headset on. The noise that was being produced by the clamor up front in the engine. The big end of the number 2 rod had broken, and moving on to the next slide, the temperature went above 220. Before the engine actually blew, and that was some big hole we'll show you in a bit, the temperature gauge had redlined. I advised the tower, Bryan Army Airfield Tower, and they gave me a clearance to land on runway 18 at Fort Rich. That wasn't my intention at first, but things happen quick, and things deteriorate quickly too. So lucky to have Fort Richardson in the area, and that was the final decision made. As the rod was beating away, the case was ultimately pierced. We're on the next slide now that shows a very big hole in the engine case, and that was that essentially the windshield was instantly covered with oil once that case was pierced. So that was a very I wouldn't say traumatic event, but I immediately advised Bryant Tower I couldn't see because of the oil on my windshield. So moving on to the next slide, there's a picture there of undulating terrain. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Bryant asked if I wanted crash fire rescue. I told him no, and that was the wrong thing to say, but a military pilot advised the tower to call crash fire rescue immediately, and they did. And anyway, and Dan, chime in anytime. Any comment you want to make?
Oh, you're doing great, thanks.
Okay, I slipped the aircraft's nose to the right, looked out the side window, and I could immediately thought, hey, there's a lack of reference to line up on. This terrain is uneven, it's snow covered, hummocks haphazardly covered with bushes. That picture there on this slide here is it's to the northeast of Bryant Army Airfield from the direction I was coming in on, and you can see this is not exactly what my sight picture was then at the time, but it gives you an idea of if you're looking out the side window how it could be a little disoriented to try to land straight ahead. It would be easy to skid and flip without something to line up on, is what I thought, and I thought that instantaneously at the time of the incident. But 3 cylinders kept producing some power and lots of noise. This the pictures on the next screen here show Bryant Army Airfield today, well paved, large, mostly helicopter operations there. That's the top picture, and the bottom picture is closer to what it might have looked like on the day that I went in to Bryant. I've got 1 landing at Bryant, no takeoffs, and but Bryant is off to the lower left of this lower picture there. To the right side of that picture, bottom right, that's actually a road and not a landing strip or anything else. So it is different than it was 28 years ago, but the general layout of the airport is it's the same. There was a deafening metal-to-metal cacophony I talked about. The motor was dying, spraying its lifeblood in my face. Not literally, because I had a windshield, but Merrill was just 5 miles away, and that was too far. That hurting bird was definitely going down, and I really thought that I kept a positive mental attitude about it, but definitely knew that there was some issues. If Bryant was the nearest emergency field, if I was over water, like Dan and I have been so many times for extended periods, I might have milked some distance. But I was lucky to have the field, and like one of my personal heroes, General Jimmy Doolittle, said, I could never be so lucky again. So that has colored the way I live my life, knowing that I've already been very lucky. So I want to be careful as well. So moving on to the next slide, picture shows right after stopping on the runway. Once in the runway environment, I could line up and nicely. I could remember just as plain as yesterday, looking out the side window, seeing the lights and the pavement on the left side, and I knew that I could land that thing straight ahead because I had a definite sight picture. And I landed along. The crash fire met me where I rolled out on 1-8. Tower told me to shut down the engine, and even though it was beating, and I defer to Dan on this, but I mean, it was so imbalanced it could probably tore the engine mounts off. But anyway, it was still running, so it was potentially I could have taxied off. But the tower advised me to shut the engine down. They'd get me a tow. The fire chief and the tower chief participated in the recovery, and the fire chief, he was concerned about getting that airplane stopped and minimizing the oil on the surface. So, all these different things you might not think about in an emergency, but our professionals do. So he wanted that oil, and they brought out mats and stuff, and made sure that there wasn't oil left on the runway to cause any further problems for anybody. And I had lots of help and support, obviously. I had a friend who was an experienced mechanic helping tremendously, volunteering to take the wings off the airplane so we could transport Skippy off the military base by truck. And we did consider, the potential of taking the airplane off the base with the wings on it. There's a major highway nearby, but at the time, and I'm sure it's the same today, there was a lot of restrictions on an extremely wide load as far as time to operate, who you can get to do it, a bunch of permits and escorts and that sort of thing needed. So the easiest way, least bureaucratically way to do it was basically to take the wings off and put it on a tow truck. So the vehicle tow truck operator had a newer lift ramp, I call it newer, tow truck, at least it was up here at the time, where he could lower the bed and just winch the airplane right on it. He got quite a kick out of it, and then we drove it back the 5 miles to Merrill Field. And here's a picture on the next slide of Merrill Field, and actually the 172 is actually parked close to there right now, just across from Alaska Regional Hospital from that spot. And there was no good answers to the cause. The engine hadn't been making metal. Nobody could say for sure. Maybe there was intergranular corrosion in the rod, but at the time, I pretty much, with my wife and I deciding is that, okay, it's just time to move on. There's a lot more personal stuff involved in this story that I did put into the Airfax Journal article, and maybe it was time for a break. But I never really considered it at the time life-changing, but, you know, or influencing your life. But as you go on with the years, you think about things, and I didn't give this much of a thought a lot over the years. But it was always there in the back of my mind, the practices that I instituted with myself. Really, I pretty much had it under control beforehand, but this just emphasized the reality, which it would for anybody who has an experience like that. And that's part of what we want to do here is pass along our experiences and what's really important. So moving on to the slide now, there's Skippy again with the oil-covered front end of the airplane, and lessons to survive catastrophic engine failure and things to live by, because it really does affect your life. I was lucky, nobody got injured, and there was actually no damage to the aircraft other than the mechanical. So things that I try to live by personally is know your aircraft, and if there's any issues with the aircraft, want to heed those issues, you know, if it's giving you any warning signs, and to basically take care of them, because life is precious. And I think I used up my one lucky break. So another item is keep your wits about you. I didn't intentionally think about this, but I just focused on what was happening, and so from that regard, there was no fear, let's say, the feeling of fear or pit in your stomach type stuff. There was no time for prayers. I say them before and after. And interestingly enough, you know, we when we have engine practice, a lot of times we trim for best glide. In this particular case, I was producing some power. The engine was producing some power, so keep the airspeed up. I mean, it beats stalling out. It also beats landing short. You know, every system or every situation is going to be different, but you know, if you can keep the power up or keep the speed up and reach your intended destination, that beats landing short, or as so many folks do over the years, unfortunately, stall spin. And land straight. Again, very lucky that this disoriented terrain, I was over low level. I made the airport where there's many references that you can line up on. Also, I personally have always felt this way, but in the little things, treasure those first responders, those folks that are unsung heroes out there. They're at the ready. They're at the ready today. They were at the ready then. And they're you name it, from air traffic control to the fire department, police, the people that are going to respond in an emergency. Any of those folks, treasure them and pay it forward. Same there. I mean, I talked a little bit about a lot of the support I had, but you never know when you're going to need a lot of help, and so pay it forward. Help other people when you can. You know, the golden rule. And then the other part of it was that keep flying. You know, don't let an incident get to you. Just keep flying, and you'll do better than not flying. There's too many rewards from flying. So, Dan, let's shift gears now and talk about avoiding catastrophic engine failures, and get some tips on how to make the journey to TBO.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for the information about that catastrophic failure. You did the right thing in flying the airplane, keeping your head about you, dealing with the tower there. Even though it's a military facility, they were glad to help you, and that's really cool. When I'm talking about tips to reach TBO, and I think about the airplane that you're currently flying, you were able to operate that aircraft safely up to TBO or slightly beyond, and it's important that you do everything right with these little engines, and they're a great. Our certified engines are hard to beat. In my flying experience, I have had no catastrophic failures, and I've been lucky. I've had some that tried to quit, but there's little tricks you can do sometimes. Sometimes a magneto, one of the magnetos could go so bad that the engine doesn't want to run, even though the other magneto is working. It's got the timing so confused the engine doesn't want to run. So a trick is to switch mags, and when you find the mag there that runs right, stay on it, and then get to a safe place to land soon. But that's what dual mags are all about. But one of the biggest keys, I think, is to fly regularly, year-round, and exercise those engines. The little Lycoming engines are kind of prone to cam corrosion or rust. That camshaft is higher up in the engine in a Lycoming and a little prone to that. So just keeping the engine exercised properly makes a big difference. And just running it on the ground doesn't really get warm enough to get rid of moisture, so go fly it. I think one of the biggest things is warming up your engine properly. A lot of people, those pistons start heating first and expanding, and it's real important to warm up those engines carefully till your oil is warm, and then the engine is ready to operate at power safely. I've owned some aircraft with Pratt & Whitney 985s, like a de Havilland Beaver aircraft, and it would sometimes take 15 minutes. As a float plane, I would have to go out for 15 minutes to really warm that up before I would add power. They have a lot of oil in the oil tank, and it just took that much time to warm them up. But a spin-on oil filter is helpful, I think. A lot of people these days usually put spin-on oil filters, and then you can cut them open and get an idea about the health of the engine, if it's making any metal or what kind of metal. Of course, changing oils regularly is real important. On this slide here is an antique Texaco aircraft oil can, and it's kind of cute. But I typically like to use the part synthetic oil here in Alaska, like a 1550 that is part synthetic, because synthetic has some great attributes, but also regular oil also that helps keep any lead or any metals in solution. Anyway, I like that idea of regular oil changes. Oil's cheap compared to engines. Leaning your engine properly is important. I suggest exhaust gas temperature gauge to lean your engines carefully, and of course avoid shock cooling. It's one of the hardest thing on engines is you keep power in the engine. It also important to keep some power on the engine in a descent in case you encounter carburetor ice, because then you have some heat in the engine to help get rid of the ice. a lot of people say below 32 degrees, but sometimes even a little above 32 degrees is a good idea to heat the engine. And using the proper fuel for the engine, I think, is real important. One thing about aircraft fuel, 100 low lead, is that it's got additives to keep the fuel fresh longer. And sometimes we'll see airplanes that sit around the airport for a long time, and then people go fly, and that fuel seems to still work. So it's a good thing. Where car gas can crack and the molecules can change, and this maybe not as safe as good aviation fuels. One thing you want to do in working around an engine is monitor the oil consumption. Once the oil consumption starts going up, it's kind of an indicator that the engine's starting to get sick. And especially, if you see no oil leaks, it's probably blow by and it's going by the rings and getting sick. So watch your oil consumption. Your exhaust stacks, the color of the exhaust, that nice light brown color, is an indication that it's running well. If it starts getting real black, there's probably either too rich or some other problems. Push rod tube steel leaks start happening too, a little blow by again. Sometimes you can tell if the oil pressure gauge chases the throttle. So if you add a little throttle on the ground and you watch the oil pressure jump up with it, it might move a tiny bit, but if it's moving with the throttle, an indication that oil pressure on the main bearings might be getting a little, make sure your compressions are good. They've kind of laxed a bit on compressions. It seems lately that even at 60 pounds, an engine should produce its rated horsepower. But a lot of people like to change that cylinder if it gets at 60 pounds or close to it. And you can replace cylinders, do top overhauls on these little engines. It's fairly common, and it seems to work well. Usually the bottom end bearings should go a long time if they're, if everything's right. But then it comes the time to, like Marshall did, not only change the engine, but change the airplane. That's a joke. There were some other tips. Next slide shows monitoring exhaust gas temperatures, cylinder head temperatures, and operation lean a peak. Some people are operating lean a peak, but typically that should be done where you're in a fuel-injected engine, maybe with GAMI injectors or balanced injectors, and very good. Each cylinder can be monitored for exhaust gas temperature and cylinder head temp, and it's really for somebody that flies probably a lot of long cross-country flights. A doctor here in Alaska flies a Bonanza to Hawaii, and everywhere he goes, and he flies Lena Peak, and he's just really praises the engine life he gets and the fuel economy, of course. But you need to be really on the gauges there, watching that all the time. For us guys that are out flying around in the hills and doing a bunch of other stuff, I don't think it's quite the right thing to do. But it can happen. And again, we're talking about make sure they develop full power on a run-up, and any roughness could be the sign of a sticky valve, and could just keep an idea. Even though you have the IA annual your airplane every year, it's really up to the pilot to keep track of how the airplane's doing. And if you fly the airplane a lot, then you're kind of wearing the airplane, and you'll know when something's not quite right, and then take care of it. The other thing I think is kind of important to do is do a post-flight inspection. When you get back on the ground, look around for any oil leaks that may have happened, anything that might have gone wrong with the airplane in flight, so you can take care of it before you're planning to go on your next flight. But the real deal is follow the manufacturer's recommendations and TBO limits. I know as a private operation, Part 91 pilot, you can fly the aircraft engine on condition, and some people fly them over TBO, and that's fine, but be very cautious at that, because the manufacturer says this is what they recommend, and it's for a reason. And Marshall, can we go back to you a little bit, or do you have some other questions for me there?
Well, just a comment right now about a decision to replace the engine, and you talked about developing full RPMs, static RPMs, and roughness. Is that when the time came, after going beyond TBO on the Cessna with the Continental 300 six-cylinder engine, one day I was flying fine, parked it. Next day came back, started it up, and immediately I knew something was wrong. It was running rough and did not develop full RPM, static RPM, and yet I did a mag check. The mags are fine. I mean, just 50 RPM drop. How could that be? So keep your wits about you again on analyzing and on condition. And I knew that there was a problem. So I took it to the A&P, who has been a mentor of mine and has just given me so much good advice and learning over the years. And together with him and with Dan, we came to the conclusion that it was time not to replace cylinders. And I do think that, as you go along, that replacing a cylinder, like what you talked about, Dan, is there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't reflect on anything other than that, it's time came and went. The on-condition piece of this is that on-condition doesn't mean that you're going to get even to TBO. It just means that you're going to have a really good knowledge of what, situational awareness of what is happening with your airplane and your engine in particular, and how it's the health of the engine. So we talked a little bit about what to do, and it came to the conclusion that it had served a useful life and time to overhaul or replace. Now the 0300 with a magnesium case, that's still a potential loss leader, because they got to break the case open to even check and see if there's been corrosion in the case. So the expense gets to be to the point where you might want to just consider buying another engine, and that's what I did with the help of my IA and with Dan, and just couldn't be happier. But that's where help and support comes in too, is go to the right people. And as far as the risk assessment, are you going to cover the risk assessment slide, Dan?
No, I was hoping you would do that one.
Okay. These tips to reach TBO risk assessment, I think Dan put it real well. Generally speaking, follow the recommended TBO limits. There are, in the end, for Part 91 pilot, it's your call. Resources obviously can be an issue. We talked about a little bit about that with making that judgment call. If you work closely with your A&P, you'll be able to make an informed decision on how to proceed as you monitor the health of the engine. And I think Dan alluded to the fact that that the manufacturers give you a recommended limit. So if there is an accident, anticipate or be prepared for legal issues. That doesn't mean they're going to develop, but that's part of the whole calculus of and if you're making good, informed, on condition decisions, well, then you're in good shape. But you will, as I've said, you'll generally be giving warnings. Heed the warnings, and this is all about staying alive. We didn't put the first part of this thing up to scare anybody, but things happen even when you're systematic and thorough. So be careful. And any further comments on that before we do a little bit on COVID-19, Dan?
Well, no, I think you covered that well, but it's just the cost of an accident is just crazy, how much, especially if there's any kind of fatals. The cost to the whole, not only just for the loss of the airplane or the loss of a life, but it's a huge loss all around, and it's air taxi operators that have a fatal. It's a huge cost to them, to everybody involved. So try, of course we all do, but by operating the aircraft safely like this, it makes such a difference and really limits the risk of those high cost accidents and legal issues, as you mentioned. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I think you could talk about some of the COVID situation that we're facing now.
Real good. And, obviously we can't give medical advice. We wouldn't pretend to. I'm a layman all the way around. But the reason we're going to mention this is because we are not going to encourage you to go flying. However, if you do go, or if you are considering going, this is right now as we're speaking the age of COVID-19, and we hope things are going to get better. They're starting to do test vaccinations, that sort of thing. But right now, you got to think of the safety of yourself in regards to COVID-19 and to others and what impacts you might have from potentially flying. One of the items, there's a social isolation. Flying solo, can you do that? Well, sure. When I say sure, that flying solo, that's social isolation, I suppose. But remember, if you're flying somewhere, consider other required isolations and other mandates. If you take your airplane, which can go pretty much anywhere, you may be looking at taking it across state line or something at a significant mandate like 14 days of quarantine, depending on where you're going. And very significant. Need to know about them. Need to think about them. And if you're going somewhere even where it's open in general terms, are there services available? Well, maybe. Food, fuel, bathrooms, they're locking those up. Got to call directly to find out what the availability is and check your NOTAMs. Take care of your maintenance workers. If you're going to do any maintenance, disinfect your airplane and let it sit. As far as pickling goes, you may want to consider that if you're not going to fly. And I'll put down here, don't crash, mitigate to the max. What that's all about is just what we've been talking about the whole time, is that you don't want to have first responders trying to help you out, and potentially risking their lives when they've got bigger fish to fry. And pardon me for saying it that way, but we're talking to Part 91 type operations here for proficiency and general maintenance type things. And yes, they're very important as that goes, but we also think that you got to watch out for the other man too. That's part of the whole golden rule thing. And there is a contact the CDC, keep up on the latest. There's a link on the page to that. And any other comments on COVID right now that I left out, Dan?
No, I think you covered that well. But I do encourage people to stay proficient. Proficiency is so important. So if you can fly safely in your area or from your private script, be very proficient, and you'll do great with your airplane. And but think safety.
Excellent thoughts, Dan. And as we wrap this up, we're the AIRROUTE66 guys. We want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and especially Sun and Fun for making the opportunity for us. If you have questions, you can just email me or Dan at the addresses, the email addresses on the screen. And also, if you'd like to subscribe to our list that we're just beginning to build, just send us an email that says subscribe in it, and we'll add you. We don't have anything specifically going on right now, but as far as subscribing to a list of information, we'll have some coming out potentially as things go along. But love to communicate with everybody out there, and thank you so much.
Thank you.